Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us for today's program, New Pathways to STEM, Increasing Access and Opportunity in Science Education. My name is Paul Andrew. I'm the Vice President for Public Affairs and Communications at Harvard University. And here at Harvard, collaboration with local public schools is of particular importance to the university and its educational mission. And we're pleased to host a conversation today designed to connect campus and community through the lens of education. This program also follows National STEM Day and Massachusetts STEM Week, bringing together schools, nonprofits, colleges, and employers across the Commonwealth to increase student awareness of STEM and excite them about their own potential futures across STEM fields. The Commonwealth has focused its campaign on the theme, See Yourself in STEM. Women, people of color, first-generation students, low-income individuals, English language learners, and people with disabilities remain underrepresented in STEM industries, despite making up an increasing portion of the overall workforce. It is clear we need more young people empowered to see themselves in STEM, and we appreciate the Commonwealth's efforts. As our expert panel, this week is not without significant challenge. This work is not without significant challenge, but increasing diversity and equity across STEM fields, be it in the classroom or in the workplace, has the power to support individuals, help society, and impact the way we innovate. So before I introduce our panel, a few items of business. This event is being recorded and will be posted on the Harvard local YouTube page in the coming days. We've received a large number of advanced questions, and those will be from many of you during registration, and we've shared those with our moderator, and we'll aim to get to as many of those as possible during the panel discussion. We have a remarkable panel lined up, so I'll be brief in introducing today's participants, and I know you'll have the opportunity to hear more from them in the discussion ahead. Joseph Graves is an Associate Dean for Research and Professor of Biological Sciences at North Carolina A&T University. His professional work is rooted in the evolutionary genetics of aging and untangling genetic misconceptions around the biology of race and racism in American society. He also serves on the faculty steering committee of LabXchange's Equity Project, which we will learn more about today. Marty West is the Academic Dean and Professor of Education at the Harvard Graduate School of Education and a Faculty Research Fellow at the National Bureau of Economic Research. He's Deputy Director of the Harvard Kennedy School's Program on Education Policy and Governance and Executive Director of Education Next, a journal of opinion and research on education policy. Since 2017, he has also served on the Massachusetts Board of Elementary and Secondary Education. Mike Edmondson is Amgen's Vice President of Global Field Excellence and Commercial Diversity, Inclusion and Belonging, where his team steers increased awareness, education, and strategic focus while driving work streams to enhance staff diversity, recruitment, retention, and align business applications. He has also served as the Amgen Black Employee Network Global Lead. Amanda Dillingham is the Program Director of Science and 12th grade Dean of Students at East Boston High School. She's taught in the Boston Public Schools for more than 10 years, and her commitment to science education is shown through her leadership of a variety of science programs at East Boston High, including a science mentoring program, annual science night event, and enrichment programs for AP science classes. We're grateful to have all their panelists here today. And lastly, we're especially grateful that this panel will be expertly led by Dean Bridget Long of the Harvard Graduate School of Education. Dean Long is an economist who focuses on the transition from high school to higher education and beyond. Her research examines the impact of factors such as affordability and academic preparation on college student outcomes. In addition to serving as Dean, she is also the Saris Professor of Education and Economics at the Harvard Graduate School of Education, where she's been a member of the faculty since 2000. She's also someone who we know as passionate about working in and with the local community. Dean Long, thank you for your engagement on so many issues addressing equity in education. We're delighted to have you and our panelists today, and I will now turn it over to you for the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Paul. It's wonderful to be here with all of these esteemed panelists, and I know that this is going to be a wonderful conversation. So welcome everyone for joining us. There are many, many reasons why STEM education is important. First of all, we know this is a growth sector. As an economist, I can't help but mention that employment in STEM occupations has grown 79% since 1990. And according to the US Bureau of Labor Statistics, STEM jobs are projected to grow about 11% from 2020 to 2030, a higher rate than non-STEM jobs, with positions in computing, engineering, and advanced manufacturing leading the way. But the importance of STEM education is about so much more than just jobs. STEM fields demand curious individuals eager to solve the world's most pressing problems. And the study of STEM subjects teaches critical thinking skills and instills a passion for innovation. Engaging in STEM means engaging in problem solving and exploring the world, skills and a mindset that will help students find success across numerous areas and disciplines. However, too often, the opportunity to learn and to be inspired by STEM is not available. Only 20% of US high school graduates are prepared for college-level coursework in STEM majors. And fewer than half of the schools in the United States offer computer science classes. So that begs the question, are kids going to be ready to meet the evolving, growing landscape of STEM professions? And the problem looks even worse when we consider the persistent inequities found in STEM fields. The opportunity to engage in STEM education is not equally distributed by income, race, ethnicity, or gender. For example, Native American, Black, and Latinx students are the least likely to attend schools that teach computer science, as are students from rural areas and economically disadvantaged backgrounds. It's not surprising that these differences in educational opportunities lead to very large differences in what we see in the labor force. Latinx workers, who are 17% of the labor force, make up only 8% of all STEM workers. And although Black workers represent 11% of the US workforce, they make up only 6% of life sciences and only 5% of engineers. And women are particularly underrepresented in STEM fields. Although women account for about 47% of the workforce in the United States, they hold only 25% of computer and mathematical occupations and just 15% of engineering jobs. So these patterns underscore the large inequities that we see in STEM learning and engagement. And in fact, we are shutting students out of opportunity. So this hits really close to home, particularly locally. The need for STEM graduates is especially important in Massachusetts because more than 40% of all employment in the Commonwealth revolves around innovation industries, such as clean energy, information technology, defense, and advanced manufacturing. So what can we do about this? Well, I'm very proud to be the Dean of the Harvard Graduate School of Education, a place that has long focused on supporting students and training educators and leaders to open new pathways of access to STEM. There are those who are working to enhance computational literacy for all, such as Karen Brennan with her Creative Computing Lab. The lab supports K-12 educators in designing computer science learning experiences with the aim of enabling learners to imagine themselves as creators. Others, such as Chris Dede, are studying the potential of artificial intelligence and online learning to train and support adult learners in the STEM workforce. Chris's initiative, known as the AI Institute for Adult Learning and Online Education, will help to address the change in skills needed in the job market due to rapid increases in technology. And then there's the work of the EcoLearn project led by Tina Grotzer and Chris Dede, which focuses on making field science more accessible to young children and their teachers using virtual reality. And there's work that is happening through our teacher education programs and professional development. In fact, many of our HGSC students and alumni stand out as leaders in STEM. For example, Sergio Estrada, who is a full-time physics, chemistry, and engineering teacher at Riverside High School in El Paso. And he was honored with the Ernest and Sarah Butler Award for Excellence in Science Teaching last year. And Margaret Wang, she's a 2020 graduate of our master's program in international education policy and a co-founder and chief operating officer of Subject to Change, an online connector for K-12 teachers of all subjects to find credible, unbiased, and engaging materials related to climate change. These are all just a few of the great ideas and the amazing work that is ongoing to address the inequities that we see. And I know we're looking forward to learning even more from the distinguished panel. But before we go to the panel, I want to recognize one additional person who definitely was working towards solutions to the inequities we see and who had a considerable impact in improving access to and engagement in STEM education. Nearly a year ago, on November 11th, we lost our friend and colleague, Rob Blue. Rob was a passionate advocate for education and the driving force behind LabXchange, and one of the reasons we're having this conversation today. Access was at the core of all of Rob's many contributions to education at Harvard and beyond. He envisioned a world without barriers, where opportunity was available to anyone, especially in science. And so in everything that he did, he created environments in which learners of all ages, of diverse backgrounds could come together to imagine, learn, and achieve. LabXchange, Rob's free online learning platform for science, was his most expansive vision and one that continues to inspire educators and learners around the world. With LabXchange, Racial Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion in Science Education Project, I know that's a mouthful, but Rob challenged science learners, scientists, and educators to commit to ending racial inequity. And in the early stages of the project, not long after the murder of George Floyd, Rob wrote, "As America convulses in anger, sadness, and frustration at the senseless killing of people of color, it serves to underline yet again the individual and societal costs of systemic racism. For some, it is easy to forget the persistent rhythm of racism and inequity that is so much a part of daily life for so many others. Undoubtedly, many have already done so. We must combat these cycles of collective numbing and actively engage the problem each and every day, because this struggle is everyone's struggle." So while we all miss Rob, his words and his creations stay with us. And so now I'm excited to turn to the panel. How we address unequal opportunities is essential for how we prepare the next generation. And this is sure to be an engaging conversation on this issue. We'll start with our opening remarks, beginning with Marty West, again, Academic Dean, and Henry Lee Shattuck, Professor of Education at HTSC, my colleague. He's also a member of the Board of Elementary and Secondary Education for Massachusetts. Marty, last month, the Massachusetts Executive Office for Education and the STEM Advisory Council hosted the Mass STEM Week. Now, obviously, there's been increased focus on STEM subjects and fields, but how do we ensure from a policy perspective that opportunity is equally distributed across the Commonwealth?
Well, thanks, Bridget. It's an honor to be with you and with the rest of the panel today. Before I answer that somewhat sweeping question that you posed, let me step back for a moment and just say a word about why STEM education is a priority for us on the Board of Elementary and Secondary Education and for the Baker and Politano administration, with which we work very closely on education policy in the state. Those same patterns that you mentioned nationally are very much in play here in Massachusetts as well. STEM workers represent 17% of the workforce currently, more than almost any other state, and growing rapidly. And we know that these STEM jobs are jobs with higher wages. They're jobs that sit vacant for longer. And this is a sector where we do see the same gender and racial gaps that you mentioned in terms of participation nationwide here in the Commonwealth. That's particularly the case when you look at just access to any STEM job, but access to the most rewarding STEM jobs. That's where the disparities are most pronounced. So we have tried to make it a priority through events like the STEM Week that you just mentioned. We had thousands of programs across the state, touching more than 100,000 students. Through that type of programming, we try and do a few things that I think speak to some answers to your question about how do we, from a policy perspective, address this challenge. In those events, we try to work through teachers to convey to students the breadth of STEM opportunities, that it's not all sitting in front of a computer or being in a science lab, but that there are STEM opportunities in a wide range of fields that may be of interest to them. We try to encourage educators to provide for students a more applied approach to STEM instruction, more hands-on learning, both in schools and in work-based learning experiences. And the latter obviously requires partnerships with employers. So that's something that we've been encouraging across the state. And then a third thing we're trying to do, this goes beyond STEM Week itself, is to try to create more STEM pathways that entail multi-year courses of study, especially pathways that allow students through early college programming to earn college credits and become on a trajectory to a STEM career while they're still in high school. And this appears to be a much more promising approach than sort of encouraging students to take a smattering of courses here and there. If we can provide the structure and scaffolding that allow them to build towards a career, I think we can do more. So those are some of the sort of discrete strategies that we are pursuing in STEM education in particular. But I think I'd want to step back and conclude my comments by saying that really, in order to make all those more focused efforts work, in order for them to reach their potential, the first priority is just ensuring that all students, especially students of color and girls that are underrepresented in these fields, receive high quality STEM education throughout their pre-K to 12 education. And that means, to some extent, doubling down on the basics of education policy. Above all, making sure that we have highly qualified, highly effective teachers of STEM subjects in the classroom. And that's a challenge because those that same factor that makes this such an exciting, important field, the job opportunities, sometimes make it hard to attract educators into the profession because they have those same opportunities that we want for our students. And so I think figuring out how to make sure that we have the types of teachers that we need, teachers like Amanda, that I think is our top priority.
Thank you so much, Marty. That was a great segue to Amanda, who is Program Director of Science and Biology Teaching at East Boston High School. Welcome, Amanda. As a teacher of a STEM subject, how have approaches to STEM education changed since you began your career? And in what ways can our schools and educators help students see themselves in STEM?
I want to thank you very much for having me on here. I think the best way for me to kind of answer this question is to tell you that I was in academic research as in graduate school before I came to Boston, and I moved to Boston, and I started working in Boston Public Schools for the last 14 years and have stayed here. And when I first started teaching, I remember going into the classroom from having been in an academic lab with electrophoresis and mass spec and all of this incredible equipment. And then I walked into a classroom within the next month, and I had to go to Stop and Shop to buy sugar and paper filters and kitchen chemistry in order to do work with students. And what I found 14 years ago is that we didn't have the resources and the networking and the kind of this concentrated desire to really move students in that way. And so teachers were kind of in a you fend for yourself mode. All right. So how has STEM learning changed? I think it's important to talk about how the climate for STEM learning in Boston has changed. I can specifically speak about East Boston and BPS, but with the understanding by the change in the communities in Boston, the need for a lot of the companies to have STEM workers, a desire to have a more diverse STEM workforce, came money. And when money brought to the table, teachers such as myself and other people were able to coordinate networks and harness some of that money through grant funding and build biotech labs in our classroom and build robotics labs in our classroom. And with the money and the coordinated efforts by the people who many of them are on this panel, we are able to actually introduce students to the work. They are able to do the work at a very early age. And many of those students are seeing success in those colleges and careers. So I think I'll pause there.
Thank you, Amanda. We're definitely will be coming to you again for some more questions. But now I'd like to go to Dr. Joseph Graves, who's Professor of Biological Sciences, Department of Biology at North Carolina A&T State University. He's also a member of the Faculty Steering Committee of LabX's Racial Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion in Science Education Initiative. So Joe, first, for those on this call who aren't aware, can you tell us a bit about the LabXchange model, and specifically, how do you see platforms like LabXchange playing a role in bringing access to science education for those who may otherwise not have access?
Thank you. I think that the question or the answer to some of the concerns that Amanda just presented in her I don't want to use the word testimony, but in her answer to the last question, can be solved by tools like LabXchange. At present, there are 13,000 entries on the LabXchange platform, which bring cutting edge science and cutting edge ideas in science to anybody who has access to the internet. Now, given that doing modern, particularly in biology, which is where I work, doing modern genomics and biomedical type research in high school classrooms is sort of prohibitive given the cost of reagents and equipment. A lot of that can be done virtually through the LabXchange platform. And in addition to that, what I find really amazing about what's been done so far is that the scientific content of what's on LabXchange is far in advance of most of what at least I know is being taught in biology classrooms across the country. And one that's of particular importance, particularly for historically underserved populations in science, is the treatment of biological and social conceptions of race, which is something that you just do not see in K-12 across the nation, in part because folks don't want to address the elephant in the American social living room. But those tools are available for teachers on LabXchange. So I think this is an excellent platform that really sort of shows us the way for what we should be doing in K-12 instruction across the nation and the world, for that matter.
Thank you so much, Joe. We look forward to hearing more during this panel. And finally, we have Mike Edmondson, Vice President Amgen, and also the Amgen Black Employee Network Global Lead for the last 2 years. Mike, Amgen depends on learners falling in love with these subjects at a young age and joining the workforce with a passion for discovery. What role do you think businesses play in growing STEM opportunities, and what specifically is Amgen doing in this area?
Thanks, Bridget, for the question here. And I love the term passion here because that's very relatable to Amgen as a company and how we feel about this type of work. You mentioned a couple of things there. The first thing you asked was, in general, what role do we see businesses playing? And I think the role is a huge role. It's been spoken to several times in this call already. I think one stat was given that I think in Massachusetts, I think I heard 17% of the jobs in Massachusetts and growing are of STEM nature. So that just kind of gives you a small picture of the importance and the growing magnitude, especially in this high-tech world of ours, as far as where it's going. And no doubt that STEM plays a key role in that. But as far as Amgen in particular goes here, just to give you a little bit of background as far as who we are. So Amgen, we're a very large global company of about 24,000 employees, and our mission is to serve patients. So we rely on a workforce that is scientifically literate and prepared to work creatively to solve complex challenges. So for example, the Amgen Foundation has a significant focus on high quality science education for the next generation, having contributed over like $200 million to date to advancing science education programs globally. Also, the foundation is working to ensure that everyone has the opportunity to engage in science and to see for themselves a STEM career. Okay, and in the spirit of a health equity. And we kind of do this through 4 specific programs. The first program is called the Amgen Biotech Experience. So this is a program in which empowers high school teachers in Amgen communities to bring hands-on technology and biotechnology specifically experiences to the classrooms. The second one is something that's been spoken to and will be a big part of the topic today is LabXchange, which, as you know, is a free online science education platform that provides users with access to personalized instruction, virtual lab experiences, and networking opportunities across the globe in the scientific community. Okay, the third is what we call the Amgen Scholars Program. Okay, this brings undergraduates from across the globe to participate in cutting-edge research opportunities at world-class institutions. And then fourth, okay, this is one that may not be as known, but something we're very proud of, is our affiliation with the Khan Academy in the biology content. So actually, our foundation is a biology partner with the Khan Academy and helps to strengthen science resources and available to students and teachers on that platform. So that kind of gives you a small flavor as far as our commitment to this space And we think it's a super important topic. So thanks for the opportunity to join.
Thank you, Mike. So as everyone can see, we have a range of perspectives and expertise that we're bringing to the table with this panel. I'm going to start to go to more general questions, and I invite any of the panelists to jump in with their answers. Let's start, though, within the education system, and particularly teachers. How can we reach teachers who are often the first introducers, mentors, and those on the front lines of this work? And Amanda, you spoke a little bit to this. What do we need in terms of support systems, professional development, and other efforts from our wider ecosystem, whether that be business, university, professional networks, to help prepare and support teachers? Let me open it up. Feel free to jump in.
Well, I can speak to that as someone who works with teachers every day. And I also am really excited to be on this panel because I am also an ABE teacher and went to the Amgen Biotech the experience and worked with that as well as LabXchange. So teachers need time, love, and care. No, that they need, but they do. They're working really hard on the front lines, and they need help. And so one of the things that I think is great that I can speak to specifically on this panel is in Massachusetts, for example, we have a really thriving ABE teacher community where it's always, I knew Alia happened to be, she runs the ABE program here, and she also happened to be an East Boston native. And I met her because she was a community member who wanted to reach back and put biotech in the schools. And then we connected, started talking, and the next thing you know, we have ABE and a biotech pathway 4 years later. And so teachers need great communities and network of support. They need funding, and they need great mentors in the community.
Bridget, if I can speak to that, I mean, this is one of these things. I'm a big fan of the term. This is not rocket science. And this really isn't rocket science. We live in a market-driven economy, and you're an economist, you know this. And so if you want to get the most talented people into teaching, and particularly teaching STEM, then districts have to pay competitive salaries. And I'll give you a real good example from here in North Carolina. When I was the Associate Dean of Research at the Joint School of Nanoscience and Nanoengineering, the 13 campuses of the UNC system, one year graduated 3 math teachers out of 13 campuses. And what happened to those 3 math teachers is each one of them took a job in the biotechnology industry, because the biotechnology industry was paying 6-figure salaries to people with their training. And so the bottom line is, if this nation wants to be a competitive leader in STEM going through the 21st century, it has to revitalize its vision of what it needs to do, particularly in the public schools where most Black and brown people are, with regard to producing the human and physical infrastructure to teach STEM. That requires saying that STEM is important. And of course, all the folks in this panel know that that's true. But what we have to do is a better job of helping our constituencies, the people whose kids are going into these schools, recognize that we cannot afford to fall behind in STEM education and its infrastructure. That means it's going to cost us some money. People pay, there's an old adage is, you know that when some people value something when they're willing to pay for it. And so America needs to be willing to pay through, whatever means we can decide upon to build our STEM education infrastructure so that we can produce the number of STEM professionals we need going forward.
Can I double it down on that, Bridget? Because I couldn't agree more with what Joe said about the challenges to recruiting teachers in this space. And it's actually something I've done a little bit of research on. About a decade ago, a colleague and I were able to study the entire state of Florida, and we were able to see teachers and study their career decision-making over time, both where they were working, if anywhere, before becoming teachers, and then also where they went afterwards. And one of the things that was really a clear pattern was just that math and science teachers, when they left teaching and went into other occupations, that was the only group of teachers that when they made that move earned a lot more, right? This was not the case for other teachers, and they were also more likely to leave. And it just sort of reinforces Joe's point that if we're going to attract the talent that we need into this space, we need to be paying them more. That runs up against some pretty deep norms in the educator profession about how we think about compensation and valuing everyone's contributions equally. But I think we need to be willing to at least start that conversation, that maybe, when other people have additional opportunities, we need to respond to it, or else we'll continue to see school systems really struggle to attract the talent they need in this area.
So absolutely, I want to reinforce what you all said and validate that absolutely money matters. But let me twist the question a little bit on its head, because we certainly have absolutely amazing STEM teachers who are dedicated, who are doing this not for the money, but for the love of teaching and love of their students. And STEM is an area where things have changed and continue to change and evolve very quickly. What can we do to support the existing teacher labor force, the existing teachers that are in schools who are trying to keep up with this evolving technologies, evolving science? I'm wondering if some of the tools that have already been mentioned, such as LabXchange or partnerships with business, Mike, as what you said with Amgen, can help with the existing labor force that's there. Again, just kind of pushing for what can we do tomorrow as we do push on this longer term goal of better compensation.
Well, I hate to say it, but you just said it. I mean, there are some outstanding tools. LabXchange is an outstanding tool that we need, of course, to do a better job of introducing students. Can
you give an example of how we might use LabXchange? Tell us a little bit more about how it might be used to further this goal.
From the simple fact that you can do things on LabXchange that you cannot do in the current classrooms. So, for example, even explaining things about how next generation sequencing works, you can do that through modules on LabXchange. Things like polymerase chain reaction, you can do that on LabXchange. So all of these cutting edge, biomedical genomic tools are available to learn on the LabXchange platform, and you can't get that in the schools presently. In addition, and I think Mike talked about the partnership that Amgen has with providing these tools directly to teachers with regard to research kits and research infrastructure that they can then have in their school. Now, this is, I think, a place where universities can do a better job, particularly in terms of partnering to teach this new generation science to teachers who have a requirement to do, in-service training. But we need more, input from us in the university to help drive these things along, especially, if we're given the tools to do so.
Mike, did you want to jump back in?
So I'll share a few perspectives here in regards just to our commitment, and really, I thought that Joe did a nice job hitting on it. But as we kind of consider our reach and programs and investments in science education, we recognize that the promise of digital, free, high quality resources to increase access is super important. So the Amgen Foundation supports Khan Academy and LabXchange, as you know, immensely to expand the reach of providing high quality assets that are freely accessible in various languages. And we feel that so not only the hands-on experience that's offered by the Amgen Biotech experience, but the virtual aspect really allows us to kind of expand that reach and capabilities in places that are beyond your typical institutions here, as set locations here. So again, that's kind of our ultimate vision as far as to kind of grow that. But that can only be done in partnerships with people like you guys here. So we're excited about where that can go to going forward.
Okay, great. And thanks. And Amanda earlier had also really emphasized networks and teachers sharing practices and sharing what they're using and how that has been important for what you've seen change in schools. So, but moving on, so a number of the resources that we have talked about have involved being online. So let's get to the root problem that we saw, particularly with the pandemic, that a digital divide still very much exists. So what can we do to help school systems and teachers help students address these digital divides so they can have access to many of the resources and tools that are available? Anyone?
I'll just jump in and say the digital divide strikes me as a relatively speaking easier problem to solve than figuring out how best to deploy these new technological assets in ways that really benefit students, which is, I think, another thing we learned from the pandemic is that effective online education is harder than many people had hoped. And so, right now, school districts in Massachusetts and nationwide actually have a great deal of federal resources that can be deployed to address broadband limitations, at least in school settings, perhaps in the broader community. So there's certainly resources required to address that challenge. But I think the bigger challenge that I hear in your question is making online education or even the deploying of online resources something that engages students and rather than alienates them. So that's my sort of take.
I can also add to that. I agree with you. I do think that that is a kind of a logistical problem that Boston Public Schools and East Boston did a great job with. When you had the online divide, everybody kind of coordinated efforts, and we got every student in our school a laptop, and we worked with families who didn't have internet. So that was solvable. Once we understood we were in it for the long haul, that was the first thing we fixed. The second thing that happened is we immediately shifted as a whole school, and I'm sure district, but I'll speak to the school as far as learning practices. I can tell you that LabXchange absolutely saved the biotech program that year. Because we had a functional lab, and I broke my heart when that happened, except that we switched immediately to LabXchange. And so instead of students micropipetting in classroom, we did micropipetting simulations, and we actually went through the biotech curriculum using that piece. So that was there. I will tell you, while we worked hard around digital learning, and it is great, seeing the kids and the students all come back to school this year and their faces when they got to see each other and their teachers cannot be downplayed. I think human interaction and the need for public education and students to be together with their teachers is it's huge. So
if I could build from that, Amanda, because it sounds like you and we definitely saw this at many schools and within the Boston Public Schools, there was the pivot during the pandemic. Now that we can be back face to face, though, what lessons do you carry forward, and what do you think about the role of these online tools, even when we can be face to face?
We learned a lot. So I think with you look at the the tragedy that the pandemic is, and then you pick the best out of it. And so what we learned is the teachers had to learn. Everybody was forced to learn a lot of new technologies that we now are proficient in. So that's, I guess, your blessing or your cherry. So now the teachers came back and they know how to do Google Classrooms and have that set up. They know how to do Jamboards and have that set up. They now use LabXchange as a precursor to working with the micropipettes afterwards. And so they've taken some best practices from that. And now we're working and saying, how can we create like a hybridized environment that best supports our students as a result of that pandemic?
Okay. So you all have discussed different attempts and solutions and approaches to trying to deal with the inequities that we see. One thing I'm curious about, and perhaps others in the audience, is how do we ensure the efficacy of these different approaches? So how do we know if they're working? How do we know if we're being successful? I'm curious, from you each had different perspectives and different approaches, but how do you reflect on knowing if we're going down the right pathway? Whoever wants to jump in first. But it really is a question for all four of you.
So Bridget, maybe I'll give maybe a specific example of something that we did. Then I'll kind of tell you how we're measuring along the way. So as you heard in my introduction, I was a former global lead of our Angela Black Employee Network. And so we actually with the Amgen Foundation to kind of discuss some solution-oriented approaches here to the health equity problem in general, and STEM in particular. Okay, so basically with the Amgen Foundation leadership within Amgen, we basically looked across the various Amgen sites around the country and actually beyond the U.S. Boundaries here to identify organizations that are actively advancing social justice and extending science education programs to explicitly reach communities of color to address those racial disparities in science education. So we recognize the importance of increasing diversity in the biotech industry, and especially in the STEM. Okay, and we're really proud of our foundation's commitment between the last 2 years, 2020 through this year, and actually some of these commitments are extending for another 3 or 4 years. Okay, to actually move the needle on racial and social justice. So this kind of breaks down to $7.5 million in 2020, $2.5 million in 2021, and approximately 60 separate grants were made under this initiative. Okay, so the LabXchange equity project alone was funded by $1.2 million under this initiative. And so, as you can imagine, within corporations like Amgen, we basically measure everything. Okay, and so actually we're kind of tracking the progress, the impact, and the efficacy to make this more of a sustainable results over time here. So that's kind of our approach. That's maybe one case study as far as how we did that. Maybe a best practice for others to kind of follow and emulate.
And, you know, and if I can add to that, I mean, there are established tools to determine and measure student learning in science. And those can be applied to both the online platform and they can be applied to the in-class platform. And the key thing, and this is something I want to emphasize, and I'm not sure that we're emphasizing it enough. So while, you know, techniques are important for performing science, science is not techniques. It's a way of thinking about how nature works. And so what we want to do in providing these tools to students is to reinforce their ability to ask the big questions, to employ the hypothetical deductive method for understanding the way things work and to come to new conclusions. And this is why diversity is so important, because it's not just, you know, having different colored faces in the classroom or in the boardroom or in the laboratory. It's asking new questions that are going to help benefit people who have been historically underserved by the scientific enterprise. And that's why this is such a crucial moment to bring these underserved people into the enterprise of science, whether it be in the universities or whether it be in private corporations. Those voices are needed because we need a new science to deal with questions that we never saw coming.
Bridget, if I could jump in there on the question of how we know whether what we're doing is working. One of the ways that we think about that as a state board is trying to take advantage of the quite impressive at this point infrastructure of databases for answering that question that Massachusetts has developed. So right now we're able to track students all the way through their K-12 education into the state's post-secondary system and even beyond into the labor market to see the careers, the jobs that they end up taking and their earnings. And so, you know, as we think about things like the early college STEM pathways that I mentioned, you know, we have the capability at least to create as good a comparison group as possible for those students and to follow them first into the state's post-secondary institutions and over time, even longer than that. So we're trying to cultivate a mindset on the State Board of Elementary and Higher Education that, you know, whenever possible, we want to be taking advantage of the infrastructure to bring evidence to bear on these questions. I think it's a challenge sometimes when the outcomes you care about are quite a ways downstream, and we want answers today. But we have tools that we didn't have just 10 years ago to make progress.
Thank you, Marty. So at this point, I think we're going to jump to the questions from the audience, and thank you so much for the comments that are questions that are being submitted now. We also received a number of questions during the registration process. I want to acknowledge, I think we've already touched upon a question that was submitted about by Andrew, isn't it true that most students will use STEM to make decisions every day? And the fact that you're looking for more than just STEM careers, but it's a way of thinking and approaching the world, and more than just what we're thinking about with the labor market. But we have a question from Sherry. So, we've been talking about STEM, but part of the movement has been to talk about STEAM. So what happened to arts in this? Arts can connect people from all backgrounds as well as include design thinking. Thoughts on that?
I'll go. I think it's an incredible question. We just had a STEAM day in East Boston, because I do believe STEAM, when we think about science, a lot of times science has gotten away with or been divorced from thinking about criticality and students and their identity and how they see themselves or don't see themselves. And I have found that art is actually essential in working with students to bring their identity in STEM. You bring it in, and through art, students can express themselves, their culture, how they feel about life, how the science is impacting them. And to be honest with you, I don't see how you have criticality and students really thinking deeply about how they belong in science without art. So I think it needs to be there.
Thank you.
Let me say one word on that, if possible. While it's not about the A in STEAM in particular, Bridget, the question makes me think of our colleague Dave Deming's work on which types of jobs have seen the most rapid growth. And he finds that it's those jobs that require both math skills and social skills that have really experienced the fastest growth in recent years. It's not those that only require math skills. And that really what seems to be driving it is the combination of those two things. And so that's just a reminder to me that as we talk about the importance of preparing students for STEM careers, the most successful STEM careers require a much broader education than STEM alone.
Okay, thanks for reemphasizing that and the importance of collaboration as well, and working together. So building from that, part of what we talked about is opportunity and access to be able to study STEM. But one thing we definitely know that has been a criticism is the culture and whether or not people of color or women feel welcome in STEM workplaces and STEM fields. So how can STEM fields demonstrate to youth, to our next generation from diverse communities, that they are going to be welcome in STEM workplaces and spaces?
If I can speak to that, I am a professor at a historically Black university that was founded on agriculture and engineering. We graduate more African-American engineers than any other institution in the United States. We graduate more African-American women engineers than any university in the United States. So I think I would like to explode this sort of mythology about STEM or STEAM in general as being unwelcoming versus the sorts of institutions and their agendas with regard to STEM and STEAM. So what's different about us, and I changed my background for a reason, is that we do science for the purposes of uplifting the African-American community. And even though we are a minority of scientists, and that's been true for the history of this country, we've always been here and we've always done this work. And we've never had a problem turning out African-American graduates in STEM. So this is a question that I posed to my colleagues at the historically white institutions, to ask the question, if historically Black institutions without the infrastructure, and I want to be clear on this because we are owed by the state of North Carolina $1.1 billion in funds that should have come to us after Plessy versus Board of Education that we never got, that went to educate persons from the dominant society. So imagine what we could do if we had the infrastructure that my colleagues down the road have at UNC Chapel Hill or North Carolina State, because we're not having a problem turning out STEM graduates. And we're not having a problem with those people going into careers in STEM, both in private industry and in universities. So the problem isn't STEM. It's the problem, what are you doing STEM for?
But others like to join in. How do you think about this from more of the business side, Mike?
Well, it's interesting as I heard Joe say that, I was thinking about my daughter. And so maybe I can give you an example of what not to do, then I'll answer your question. So my daughter went to one of the major service academies. I won't name which one, okay, but it's my alma mater as well. And in her class, she was a computer engineer major, which at that school was a combination of computer sciences and electrical engineering. Long story short, she was out of 17 kids in her class, she was one of only 2 women. Okay, so that's one. And then, of course, as you can imagine, the only Black. What was interesting was that during her when she declared a major, the counselors tried talking her out of it, saying this is by far the toughest major in the school. We recommend that you take an easier course if you want to get by here. Well, fortunately, the way she's wired, she likes to be told, once you tell her you can't do something, it makes her determined to do it. So as her dad, I know that for a fact. Okay, so it worked in this case here. And so she went on, ended up being on the dean's list, and it ended up being a good story. Okay, now, had she gone to an environment like you spoke to, Joe, I can only imagine with the nurturing encouragement what could have happened. So I would say one from the institution side, just that encouragement of the students is super critical. I would say from the business side, okay, to answer your question, Bridget, something that we're actively looking for. Okay, I will say that in a pharma industry, okay, which I'm a part of the biotech industry, as well as in a STEM industry, okay, basically Blacks represent about 3%, okay, overall. Okay, let alone, okay, what that means as far as actual skilled and STEM type positions here. So we are aggressively looking for opportunities to recruit, expand, and really tap into that top diverse talent. So Joe, I may be giving you a call afterwards. I did not realize the stats on A&T. I've got a few of my good friends who brag about they're graduates of your fine university. They brag about it all the time, but now they heard your numbers here, I may be circling back with you because we're looking for partnering, quite frankly, with institutions here of your especially with stats you said. So stand by here for me to circle back with you.
Maybe one of your people has already talked to us, but please circle back.
Well, I have a feeling of quite a few people may be calling Joe as we're going forward, but I think there are definitely lessons to be learned from our historically Black colleges and universities, and also our Hispanic serving institutions that would be well served. I'm looking at the time, so I want to keep moving on. Mike, you just used the word partnerships. Can we talk about community partnerships? There are 2 questions. One, how can universities partner with community-based organizations like public libraries to make STEM careers more accessible? Another question from Lynn, given the importance of calculus to STEM schools, how can out-of-school partners support high school students who may not have access to rigorous math? Ideas on community partnerships? Or even examples. I don't know, Amanda, if you have some examples that you're seeing in East Boston.
Sure, I'd love to. Before that, I'd like to give a piece of advice that was told to me last year in working in a program. And I was talking about this many of the questions I was raising and trying to figure out. And a person very dear to me said, Amanda, stop working for students and start working with them. And in the way I was speaking, it was for, I'm doing this for, and they said with. And that goes with communities as well. And so one of the things that I heard Dr. Graves say is when you're uplifting communities, your networks, your families, your communities, the people who love the students the most, their families, they a lot of times have the networks, the communication, the mentoring, everything that you need. So if you put it all together into these neighborhood network partnerships, I think that you can really help lift students very, very quickly. One example that we found too, that you asked me for an example, is Latino STEM Alliance. That has been a beautiful and very budding partnership that we just started to put robotics in and, called in different places. So I just want to say, yeah, there's a lot of examples of neighborhood partnerships that we work with all the time in East Boston to help students.
Yes, I hear that again and again from many of our Boston public schools and other schools of how they've successfully been able to expand how they work with students, what they're able to offer students. Marty, did you want to jump in real quick?
Yeah, just on the topic of partnerships, I was again reminded of a colleague's research, in this case, Ebony Bridwell Mitchell, who has done some really fascinating work looking at New York City during a period when the school system really encouraged schools to establish partnerships as a key part of their academic programs. And one of the things she found was that the more advantaged schools, the schools with greater resources, stronger networks at the outset, were able to make much better use of that environment, establish more and more substantial partnerships, and that other schools really struggled. And so I think as we think about partnerships as a way of, I guess, closing capacity gaps or supporting the capacity of educators, we need to keep equity considerations in mind, that sometimes that type of decentralized process will maybe not have exactly the consequences that we want unless we attend to that.
Very good reminder about that. We had a couple of questions come in thinking outside of the US. So how do we address digital gaps experienced by most developing countries? The second question is, how can developed countries help to improve STEM education in the global South? Perspectives on that? We're grappling with a lot of problems within the US, but how do we think about this more globally?
Well, I'll say this here. So I was talking to the folks at the foundation yesterday, and they shared with me a statistic that was kind of interesting. I think they mentioned specifically a random country, Algeria, had over 5,000 individual usages with the exchange in the past year, and over 17 million overall. So we feel that obviously with the age of the internet and so forth here, that represents a great opportunity virtually. And also at some of our global locations here, we're actually doing similar partnerships as far as hands-on biotech experiences as well. So that's a start from our perspective.
Okay, the time has just flown by, and there's a number of issues that we've touched upon. I want to give each panelist just 1 minute if there's a final point you want to hit on or emphasize for the audience as we think about solutions for expanding opportunity and addressing inequities. Marty, do you mind going first?
Sure. I think I'll return to my theme that Joe also touched upon, which is really paying attention to the need to get talented educators into the classroom who are equipped to teach STEM subjects well. We know that compensation is one aspect of that, but we also need to think about how licensure systems can sometimes prevent people with strong STEM backgrounds who simply haven't jumped through the right set of hoops in order to enter the classroom. That can be a barrier as well. And so I think as we talk about these more, discrete strategies to drive particular forms of STEM instruction, we can't lose sight of the fundamentals of having the right people in the classroom.
Okay, thank you, Marty. Amanda.
Thank you. I guess my closing thoughts are really, when we're thinking about students, to really empower and center student voice. They know what they want and they know how to tell you, and they're learning how to advocate for themselves. So really centering their thoughts in everything, thinking about ways to support your existing teachers. They are also really important, and they do learn. They do learn. We have to create supportive networks for them to actually learn. And the companies like Amgen, Vertex are doing a great job. And then finally, the thing that we kind of touched on just for a second, but I want to give us there's a lot of movement coming in through work from Goldie Muhammad at different places to really rethink how we're doing STEM education and thinking about criticality and thinking about identity and really thinking about how that applies to science education. And I think that will help move us far. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Joe?
This is not really meant to be a plug for my forthcoming book, Voice in the Wilderness. But in Voice in the Wilderness, I discuss the moment we are in with regard to STEM. And we are facing existential crises that literally can mean the extinction of the human species upon this planet. So this is something we dare not get wrong in this moment. We need to have a new vision of how we prepare students to think critically about the world and to be able to do that in the context of becoming STEM professionals, as well as, educating a society such that it has scientific literacy. I mean, we shouldn't be a country that has the most powerful biotechnological infrastructure on the nation, but yet has less than half of its people vaccinated because people don't believe in vaccines. So we're in that moment now, and everyone is listening to this. We need to understand that if we don't do STEM right now and we don't do it in a diverse and inclusive way, we risk losing everything.
That is a very strong statement, but you are pointing out a clear fact and something that we are grappling with, as someone underscored. STEM is also civic education in many respects. Mike, final comments.
Thanks, Bridget. And I was so hoping I wouldn't have to follow Professor Graves here, but oh well. Okay, but I will say again, thanks for the opportunity to be on this distinguished panel. Enjoyed hearing from each one of the participants for sure. Okay, in all candor, it was just great to hear from Professor Graves in particular about the LabXchange project. We're so proud with the Amgen Foundation that we funded this grant, okay, for $1.2 million to partner, okay, on behalf of, to help build out this content. But I'll kind of close with this tagline here of Amgen, which we believe that everyone needs science, and science needs everyone. This is kind of our tagline with our foundation, which speaks to the mission and the essential focus on access to equity and the opportunity in STEM. So on that, I'll give it back to you, Bridget. Thank you.
Well, thank you again to our panel, Amanda, Mike, Joe, and Marty. And thank you everyone in the audience and those who submitted questions. Have a wonderful afternoon.
Thank you.
Thank you all.